Okay,
Oh, yay. Okay. I think we're live. Hi,
great.
everybody. I was having sound issues today, so we're running a little late, but I am very happy to be here with a dear friend, Barbara, who I had met, it must be 3 years ago now,
It
when
has
I
been.
went out to Colorado for my first conference on public speaking. So here we are today doing a Facebook Live, and it all comes full circle. And Barbara was such an amazing influence for me because she introduced me to the world of dreams and how important our subconscious is in terms of giving us messages and accessing our intuition and leading us forward. But I want you to introduce yourself properly and just tell everyone who's on this live. And a lot of times people watch us after the live because sometimes it's a tricky hour in terms of lunch and time zones and everything. But go right ahead. I'm so happy to connect and to have you here.
And it's wonderful to see you again. I feel it's interesting because my early years, I'm kind of in my third lifetime right now, within one life, right? And in my first lifetime, I chose to go to university and studied and became a journalist. Have a degree in journalism, so that came into my dream work, of course. And when I think about art, and I excuse me, I think about art, I think about you, I think about public speaking, I think about communication, all of those. There's every reason why art is a part of that. And so my whole life, the other two lifetimes before this, was dedicated to spiritual teaching and psych counseling and therapies and developing programs. Over 40 years as an intuitive reporter, doing reports for people all over the world with intuition, um, creating cantatas with people who thought they couldn't sing, working with children. And I'd like to talk with you about that sometime in this period, or maybe another time I could interview you with how you work with children, because I've done some fascinating things with children. I'm sure you have too. And it's so easy to bring out the child in other people when we use art, when we use color, and when we use texture, and when we use sound. And right now, I describe myself as a polymath because I do so many different things. And what I'm really invested in at this point in my life is aiding people to be liberated inwardly, to be able to turn within fearlessly and to live the life that they want to live in connection with other people. Because most of our challenges is that we feel like that communication breaks down, or we don't know how to do it. And artists traditionally are usually introverted, so they aren't too good at talking, they think. However, I've learned that they really are. So the dream work that you were talking about, because I have devoted my life since I was 6 to dream research, study, involvement with that. I founded a website called dreamschool.org that is still in operation with the School of Metaphysics. I conducted global dream experiments for 11 years. So it introduced me to lots of people over the years, and I've interpreted 35,000 dreams in my history.
Goodness.
So, that's kind of in a nutshell the background on that. So that has really curated to this constant movement of understanding dream time and understanding that we're all in dream time. We're daydreaming. We're dreaming our life right now, the way that we think about it, the way we react to it, or the way that we respond to it. And art, to me, all the arts, are means by which we can express ourselves, yes. And sometimes we can express things that we don't have words for. Sometimes we can express things that we have words for, but we don't want to say them because we know that they might be hurtful. And it's not our intent to hurt, but there's something that's eating on us. So there's something that we don't like. And certainly nowadays, a lot of that's being stirred up, right?
Yeah,
So it's
and
like,
I'd love to talk about what's happening now because I think a lot of things are happening now there's a transition, obviously, coming out of COVID,
Mhm.
but there were such varied reactions to everything that has been going on, very unique reactions from varied people. And I'm sure that has to do a lot with their stories. So I'd love for you to touch on that a little bit.
COVID, oh, wow. In terms of thought form and thought form creation and thought form projection, being trained as a journalist in the late 60s and early 70s, when journalism was uh, disciplined, where Walter Cronkite was like our uncle that was there at dinner with us, for people who are old enough to remember that. He was the trusted person who gave us a worldview. And he was the one that oversaw Vietnam War coming into our living rooms in America. And I realized that, this is very American what I'm saying right now. Um, that was a shock to most people's system in a very similar way that the COVID movement was, where all of a sudden we were willing to completely change our lives because there was at first a fear of the unknown. And as that moved through us, COVID became what Joseph Campbell called a public myth, a public dream. And so we began to dream COVID so much that we went into lockdown voluntarily. We stayed at home. And I'm not saying that there's any good or bad to this. I'm just saying this is what we did. We believed authorities that were in a position where they didn't know what they were doing yet. It was totally new. There's really no fault or blame here to what evolved, but there's a lot of room for opinion, as you know, and a need to respond now to the effects of that. I know that there was an article that came out in last fall, I think it was like September, that was actually from Europe. And the headline was, "We are in the middle of the largest psychological experiment that has ever been done on the planet, and we will pay the price." And when I read that, I knew immediately why. I knew immediately what it was, because I've experienced what it's like to not want to live and to be, to think all the way through the idea of suicide. I've also had near-death experiences that were not at all related to that. But I've walked with my dad as he was dying with Lewy body dementia. So the whole shamanic kind of idea of healing is very real to me. It's not just something I read in the book or something like that. And I use art that way. And I was able to use it with my dad to great effect with when he had Lewy body dementia, because Lewy body it's Alzheimer's, where the memory connections are loosening up so that you can actually transpose into a different life. And so it's a very natural process. It's also, with Lewy body, physical, where the physical body is also disengaged. The mind and body are disengaging. So he had the coming and going mentally, and he had times when we would what's called sift together. And we had some difficulties getting on here at the beginning, so I don't have my container they usually have. I have like a little hope chest, a box, and it's filled with sand. And the sand is pretty raw, so it has different size pebbles in it. And so the act of sifting is something that's so natural. You've probably done it when you were at the beach, where you just started playing with the sand and maybe made sandcastles, things like that. Sifting is something that is across the board. All of humanity has done some kind of work with it because it's touching the earth. And there is an energetic connection that happens there that goes through your body that creates an alignment with what's called the Schumann wave in more technical terms. But it's the vibration of the earth itself. And since we live on the earth and our bodies are made of earth, we need to have that contact. So this is an art form whereby people actually are able to clear their mind by sifting through the sand and pulling pebbles out. So the result is something like what's behind me. Let's see, backwards. What's behind me here is a SIF painting that I did this last year during COVID, that is actually about fire. And I call it holy fire because it's green. It's not red. It's green. And green is a healing vibration. It's right in the middle of the spectrum. pH, you want your pH to be green. Green foods, just think, in terms of everything we know or read about that. And it's the reality of actually working with those colors. Well, you probably can't tell a whole lot, but all of this is texturalized with sifted sand. So the process is to sift the sand first and to either clear your mind and then use the sand from there to paint with or to sift with intent. So there's a whole series that I've done. This is one of them. This is the fourth one, which is of the symbol of Om. And you can see it in here if you really look. There's the thing that looks like a 3, and then there's the dreaming. There's the awake, and then the dreaming, and then the rest. And then this is Turiya, which is the liberation, the freedom from the whole wheel of life, right? So this was done with sifted painting or sifting sand as well. Then we get into ones like this one, which was also a product while I was working with Dad as a very personal one. This is going to be the cover of the new edition of a book that I wrote, oh my God, in the 80s called What Will I Do Tomorrow? Probably Depression. And this I called The New Depression. And you can kind of see it.
It's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, it's just, and there's beads in this one as well as sand. And I placed each one of them. It was like, this took me several months to complete. And it changed form quite a bit as it worked. But every time I worked on it, I was working through his depression and my own. Because he was born in 1930. And as we were going through this, and as I was going through this process of working it through with the art, it was just so obvious. It's like, what chance did he have coming into America in 1930? The soul coming into the body. He had to deal with depression. He had to. It was in his parents. It was in everybody around him. It was in the country. And so I look at that and I think about that in terms of COVID.
And that's exactly where we are right now. Everybody is in depression, whether they recognize it or not. And it's funny, I was just chatting with a friend of mine this morning, and she was saying how she sees that in a lot of people who are overworking right now, because they're doing that to hide, a lot of them, from this need to process everything that we have gone through. And it is so much easier to get into that mode and to deal with things that you know the answers to, as opposed to processing emotions that we don't know how to process.
Yeah. And the prospect of turning within, because in the intuitive research that I've been a part of for decades, in the health analysis parts that we would do, it would identify the mental causes for the disorders, go through those, identify them, and give suggestions for correction mentally in the thinking, the ways that the patterns of thinking. It might have been something like self-value, that the person needed to work with self-value, that they didn't value themselves. They took themselves for granted, or they allowed people to mistreat them. And then suggestions on how the value could be built. Then it would go to the emotions. And this is where I learned a great deal in my 20s when I was working on the other side of the research, not giving it so much as working with recording it and that kind of thing, writing books about it. When I was working there, I began to separate out and see that that the emotions are an expression of the mental attitudes that are a converter of energy, similar to what people would call chakras, but they take energy and they convert it into physical form. And this is part of thought form creation. This is how we dream anything into existence. The rooms that we're in, these devices that we're using, they didn't always exist. They came into the minds of many people, perhaps, and through that cooperation, they came to be. And now we just take them for granted. This is part of the blessing of COVID, that it has caused us to become familiar with this new form of communication and increasingly education, which is very exciting to me because I've been invested in global education since I went to university and met people from different countries, because America is very open to all kinds of people from all over the world. And that's her beauty. That's why she's a female country, not a male one. It's like she embraces everyone, right?
Open. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in that, now we have this venue that we're speaking on right now, which again opens us up to being able to meet people that otherwise we would never have known. Never have known. And the way that that's affecting us as individuals, and the way that it's drawing the planet together, as much as we see some of the strife and perhaps poor thinking, poor reacting, and just poor behavior, that does depress us. There's also the economic part of this, which went a little bit too far, I think, in terms of its longevity, but it was facing the ambiguity. It's what you're talking about. And this is the same. What do you think about this? I think that is the major stumbling block with the arts, whether it's singing, playing instruments, fine arts, even crafts, building something, any of those. The reason why people shy away from that, turn away from it, run from it, is because they think that there's a way, their brain gets in the way, right? They think that there is something that's supposed to happen that doesn't. And they're afraid of being embarrassed. They're afraid of being exposed. They're afraid of if they're singing or talking in public, that they'll clam up, or the words will leave them, or their voice will go. I've even worked with people that they lost their voice. They were
exactly
that
what's
panicked.
happening to me today. Did you? If you didn't happen to notice, I was just on a call yesterday, and somebody mentioned a really incredible phenomenon, which I had witnessed time and again with kids, but just didn't have a name for it. And of course, I'm blanking on the particular name right now. It's probably written down somewhere, but essentially it's the fourth grade loss of drive. So somewhere around the age of 8,
Mm-hmm.
kids all of a sudden stop being creative. And a lot of psychologists have been analyzing this for decades and decades, and they came to realize that it's an actual phenomenon, because what happens at the age of 8, or around the age of 8, is that kids start to be very aware of what other people are doing. They're not so, their conscience wakes up, and they start comparing themselves to the neighbor and realizing that the unicorn that they drew probably isn't as good as the person next to them, or different, or somebody, and they're very attentive to any feedback that they get. And someone says, well, this looks nothing like a unicorn, and that just shuts them down. And there's so many people, so many adults that I teach that say that, well, I haven't done this since elementary school. And that probably means that they haven't done this since about the age of 8, because they started being embarrassed. They felt judged. They felt ashamed to not see the result that they want show up in their creations. And that just completely shut them down. And I thought it was just brilliant to have that recognition, something that I had witnessed years and years, for years and years, but to actually have a name for it, which of course is escaping me right now.
Well, when you remember it, which you will, put it connected to this, and then we'll all have it, right? Yeah. Because yes, between 0 to
I got it. It's actually written down.
Oh, good.
4th grade creativity slump.
That's a creative title. Yeah. And what it is from 0 to 7 in terms of neuroscience. The brain is not a blank slate, but it has not been wired until it starts actually activating out here, and you have sensory input from outside. That's a whole learning curve. I constantly am enthralled now with, there's a 3-year-old in my world. So when I'm with him, he doesn't talk. He doesn't like to talk. He's starting to, but he hasn't. And so, that was a concern about, and we so interfere. The Greeks didn't even send their kids to school, their boys to school, till they were 7. There's a reason for that. And there are many cultures where that's true, where people don't
go to school till I was 7.
Yeah, at Montessori does not interfere. Waldorf doesn't interfere with the process, and yet it guides. So it's not like you have a bunch of wild kids, which is what some people will judge that don't know. They haven't bothered to find out, right? So it's important to be open-minded, really important to be open-minded about you. And that's how I see art. Because when you come home to you, when I'm painting a unicorn, then I'm painting what I see inside me that's coming out. And I want it to have black stripes like a zebra, because I saw a zebra that I really like, and that's my unicorn. Just like I might want to name a puppy that someone brought home for me to play with and to grow with. And what happens is our adult egos around us get a little bit too huffy in terms of wanting to teach someone else how to do what we did in the way that we did it, instead of us evolving to that more mature teaching level, which is showing. There's that wonderful 4-tier layer of teacher, because I've taught teachers all my life. So I know about this like the back of my hand. Me first, talking about me first, learning. The mediocre teacher criticizes, like you just said. Well, that doesn't look much like you need to clean this up over here. And if you did this, then that, that kind of thing. The average teacher tells, if you start here, then this will happen. So it's not like you drop these things, because every part of them is important, but there's a wisdom and a love and compassion that grows in a really good teacher, right? So then the superior man, as Confucius would have called it, is the one who actually models. You do it. I've seen some of the pictures of you with your daughter. I think it is maybe daughter. Yes, holding the. I think it's probably either a light or a heat fan of some sort, helping you out.
My niece, actually.
At your niece, okay.
She was visiting my exhibit that I had.
I just saw it the other day on, I think, Instagram, and it was just touching. It's like, so that is the model, because you're actually doing it, and then you're letting her participate. And then the really outstanding teacher, the sage, is the one who inspires. So you reach into people and you bring them out. And that's
fascinating about this is a few days ago, I have this new class that I was teaching with 5-year-olds. And I actually tried to stay away from showing, because here's what happens. I said, we're talking about Magritte, and I said, let's put all the elements together. Let's imagine that there is a humongous, like my picture. And I said right away, my picture, I'm going to have a humongous apple. And here's what I would do with an apple. And all of a sudden, they start copying me. They start drawing the apple. And I said, well, no. Your apple does not need to look like my apple. My apple is going to be striped, because that's what Magritte did. He confused all the textures. Now, think about what your apple might look like. It doesn't have to be striped, and what's interesting is that the initial thing that they try to do is copy. So they try to do the stripes. And then after a while, it was amazing to start seeing how imagination comes out, because all of a sudden one of them screamed out, well, my apple is going to have feet. Like, that's wonderful. All right.
Right.
And then another screamed out, well, my huge apple is going to stand next to a tiny little house. And that's when you really see the wheels turning. That's when you really see their unique selves come out. And that is exactly what you're talking about in terms of inspiring, in terms of giving them parameters to work within, but then having them explore outside of those restrictions on their own and see where it takes them. And it is just so, so beautiful to see how that unfolds.
It truly is. I was teaching
Yeah.
a group that in summer camp of 8 to 14-year-olds. And there were other teachers who taught other things. And they would all be in the art class. That year I was teaching art. I decided to teach art. And so one of the things that I did was, which is a little bit different than what you're saying, but it would be another step over here, which is a form of copying, but you'll understand it. What I did was I took the self-portrait that Da Vinci did, like the line one, and I drew it basically out of their sight, before as preparation. And then I turned it upside down and I covered it. So then I'm talking to them about, art and what it is, what it isn't, whatever. We're just talking. And so they each have a piece of paper that's big. And so I say, okay, so we're going to experiment and find out, see what happens here. So I'm going to slowly reveal what's behind this white sheet of paper. And I want you to draw what you see. Just draw what you see. Because this is another doorway. Like what you were just talking about is the inside coming out and getting out of boxes and really bringing out the individuality, right? So this is blending it. I call it twilight dreaming, where it's encouraging the individual and the individuality at the same time that it's also encouraging the respectful use, perhaps, of what I would call universal law. That a straight line is a straight line, and you can make it any color you want, any size, whatever, but it's a straight line or it's a curved line of some sort, right? So there's certain universals that we agree on that are important for us to know. And I think that's a lot of what this period of time is about, is we're figuring those things out. We're figuring out that all life matters. And I have some wonderful friends of all colors and shapes and sizes that will say that. And it's not political. It has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with respecting life. And so as I was lifting this paper and they would draw what they saw, they weren't having a preconceived idea in their brain about what it was. So their mind was free. They weren't all shuttled into their brain. And so just, step by step.
Was it still upside down?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And so we would keep lifting it up, piece by piece. I make sure that everybody had whatever lines they wanted to put. It wasn't any right or wrong. They knew that. Neutrality ruled. All that stuff was off the table. And so by the time it got about halfway up, they could begin to see that it was eyes. They were, upside down, but they were eyes. So then their brain started getting involved in prejudice, prejudging what they thought it was. So then we had to have a little talk about that. It's like, nope, all that's off the table. All you're drawing is what you see. So you were teaching them how to see. And I remember when my grandmother, she was the one that really made me an artist, because when I was young, she oil painted. And so she engaged me with that. And through that venue, she taught me how to see with soft eyes, so that I could see what was there, but then I could soften and widen and extend that vision so that my mind could come in there, not just my brain and my body. So that's what was happening with the kids. And more importantly, Diana, it was happening with the adults. The adults got more excited. By the time we were done and they turned it upside down and they saw Da Vinci, and no two were alike, but that didn't matter. It was like they were going, wow, and looking at each other and going, wow, how did this happen? How it happened was actually getting out of the box by seeing what was there, right?
And letting go of the end result, because that was a surprise, right?
Exactly.
So they had no way of judging. And I think that's where adults get stuck. They're so centered on what they want to accomplish that it's really tough to just truly release into the process and let it unfold and let it show them what it wants to show them, and then go from there and kind of follow the breadcrumbs to where it's going to lead them. So in the interest of time, you said that and I know that you're a woman of many, many talents. How do you balance it all? How do you structure that? What you mentioned, and I love how you mentioned different lifetimes. And I think another way to say that is that we all have different chapters in our life. And for me in particular, it's funny because there are a couple of people said, well, it seems like you're doing something totally different now. You're doing this podcast. I'm like, what do you mean? And they said, well, this is what we see. We see you doing this podcast every week. You get on and you talk to these interesting people. And I didn't even think of this as something that I do. It just sort of happened during COVID times. And I was really curious how different folks were pivoting and moving through it and coming out of it. And I just wanted to hear how folks balance everything. So I'd love to hear from you. How do you balance it all? Do you go from chapter to chapter? Or you just tell us what you think?
It's both. Back in 1993, I stood 6 feet away from His Holiness the Dalai Lama of Tibet, and the Shaktipat of that moment, I really didn't know who he was, Diana. I mean, I knew his name, just like probably some people would say, yeah, I've heard of him, or I know who he is, I've seen a book, whatever. And at that point in 1993, I had no idea whose presence I was in. But the subsequent years, I learned a great deal that even, was part of writing a play, putting a play together called The Invitation, where he's one of the characters. And then working with, dipping into his teachings, being present for his teachings 8 different times, I started understanding Kuan Yin and what the essence of Kuan Yin is, which is the same for the Christian as Mother Mary and Sophia, wisdom. And in other words, the mother figure that's in all the cultures is there. And when I started engaging with her 100 verses, which actually were written by the Chinese people who loved her when Buddhism was brought into China. They were written between 400 and 600. And I began to do it with imagery. So in the book that I put together, there's an image for each book, and there's an interpretation that's based on 5 different translations of the verses. And so each one of those was a kind of artistic move. And what it taught me was that the movement in Guan Shi Yin is the movement between the divine masculine and divine feminine, which is the creative drive in every one of us. This is also important by age 14. We need to kind of just mention that, because I know we're in perimeters, but we need to mention that what happens by the time you reach as early as even 9, but particularly 10 to 13, 14, is the Kundalini energy, which is creative energy for the mind, for you, awakens and it begins to stir. Up until now, we've recognized that as puberty because it has physical implications. The body changes, the hormones change, all that. But that's an effect of spirit and mind going to a point in the human development or journey where all of a sudden we can be creative. So what you were talking about that happens at 8, where we can shut down or become introverted, all of a sudden we begin to be aware that there is an opposite sex. And that begins to change everything. However it may change it, it changes everything. And it's that inner urge to create that's coming up that wants to put something together to be able to have something to offer. It really is the beginning of adulthood. We don't see it that way in the States. We see that as adolescence. We call it adolescence. It really is a state of adulthood. And until we can begin to honor that and honor it with our children, then we'll continue to kind of stunt their growth. So this creative urge that rises, that's Kundalini power, it is a healing power. That's why the art of any kind is going to be so instrumental from now forward with us healing ourselves, interacting with other people to heal, being able to be comfortable. One of the gifts of working with Om in the last few years, since my father went ahead and transitioned, is the realization of Om throughout my entire body and its ability to heal, which is exceptionally important when you have COVID virus and you've got people being infected with it with vaccines and all that kind of stuff, and it's everywhere, right? And so it's we're having all these effects from it because we stirred the pot. Basically, we stirred the fire, and we'll get through it. But how are we going to get through it? How we will get through it in large part is by revaluing artistry and craftsmanship. Coming away from the, dime a dozen copies and coming back to the person who makes furniture, the person who weaves the rugs. Art is in so many life forms that we've kind of removed it. Sewing. My grandmother taught me how to sew. I taught my son how to sew. These are skills that are very...
The other thing that I just heard that I thought was absolutely brilliant was the fact that over dozens and dozens of years, we've been focusing on really within our school systems and beyond how to teach executive functions and organizational functions. But we've completely let go of this ability to be open, which is what creativity is all about. And now that we're getting into a different stage, a different chapter post-COVID, it's imperative to be open to what comes. And there's been a lot of talk in terms of reevaluating education and knowing that the future generation is going to need to figure out, because there's no algorithm for creativity. It's something that we have inside of us, and it needs to be nurtured and it needs to be developed. And it's something that has been skipped over for so many years, and so many people just don't know how to access it and how to live with it. And it just really hit home for me that that's exactly what's happening. People are afraid because they have not been shown how to do it. And it's our job, the artists and people who are privy to creativity and to what it does to our psyche and what it does to us as kind of holistic human beings, to show everyone and guide them along the way. So as we're ending here, I know we went a little over time. I'd love to hear, because I know you have some incredible things going on. What's in the pipeline for you? What's happening? How can people find you? Tell us what's coming up.
I feel like in some ways I'm getting ready to come out of a cocoon.
We all are. Yeah.
In some ways, I am burning in the rubble and the ashes of a phoenix that's going to rise here. My life's been a journey, and it's been a pretty wakeful one all the way down the line, and it hasn't finished yet. And so I know that a great deal of my work now and in the future is going to be about presence, about people coming to terms with being at ease, being at peace with who they are, and the fact that who they are has a profound effect upon everyone that they meet, and indeed upon all of humanity. Because all my life I've known that each one of us is a miracle. There's no doubt in my mind about that. Every human being is a miracle. The fact that we're walking around breathing is a miracle. And so to honor that, to bring that out in people, to be a presence that encourages that, to me, that's true, the true meeting of artistry and science, religion and science. It's like, it doesn't teeter-totter one way or the other. When you asked about balance a moment ago, it's like, I went through about 15, 20 years of trying to figure the balance thing out until I finally realized that it's not about teeter-tottering, or balancing plates, like this on your hands. It's about timing. It's all about timing. And when you were talking about pivoting really early, the people who were pivoting were people who were working with timing, and they're going to fare the best. They will be the leaders. They will be the healers. They'll be the people who help those who got floundered or stuck in the fear. And probably, as an end piece here, I do a whole talk workshop on stop. And I'm doing workshops. I'm creating coursework, all that kind of thing. You find me on Facebook. Masterliving.org is the website that probably you can find me at. And Instagram, I'm there too. The beauty of being able to understand the recognition of a whole self that does not require anything, doesn't need anything, that realizes that it has everything, and that why it's here is to give. And in the giving, the emptiness comes to receive. So a lot of what we're seeing now is clumsiness in the giving. We just have to be forgiving, and we have to be compassionate, and we also have to be strong. It's a time also for tough love. And otherwise we'll destroy everything. Otherwise everything will be destroyed. And that's not intelligent. We're more intelligent than that. So despite, where we are in evolution, that we've made mistakes that we now see are mistakes, but at the time they weren't mistakes. And we must develop an honest heart about this. We must do this for ourselves and then for each other, because we're all on a journey. And if we will go together, just like kids holding hands, I keep waiting for the next edict to come down from the government. You need to hold hands now, and it's like, because it will, in some way, it probably will, unless we just figure it out. Because the physical distancing, it needs to be over. It is not healthy, and everybody knows it. It's dividing families and things like that, and that's not good. So us coming to a kind of mature look at how we engage one another, and how we embrace one another, mentally, emotionally, and physically. Art's going to be the medium. I look at YouTube sometimes of like the Grammys and different performances, different concerts, and how everybody was there together. And they sometimes would cry at the same time in a song, that kind of thing. That group consciousness is not gone. It's not dead. It's not something that we used to do. It's very, very human, and we need it. We need that kind of healing, particularly through music. And now we're going to need it through art. And that's what people like you and I are a voice for. So thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak on it.
Yeah, thank you. This was brilliant. And I just want to end with this quote. I forget who it's by, but it just came up for me as you were talking. And it's something along the lines of, your level of success truly depends on how honest you're willing to be with yourself. And I think that's exactly what you were talking about. And that's exactly what art does. It forces you to be ultra honest with yourself. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Apologize for all the, I don't know what is going on today, all the allergies and something in the air. But
Mercury's still retrograde. Yes.
Thank you for sticking with it and for being here. And I really appreciate you. And I'm happy to chat in your world about creativity further, and teaching kids and teaching adults. And I think we're going to see a lot of things coming out in the next couple of months. So, so I'm very excited. Thanks.
I look forward to our next time.
Bye.
Bye.